Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 14th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. We're joined today by Jim Clausing online. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be here.
Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
How's it going?
I'll try not to call you Stan today. I'm not sure why that happens, but
appreciate it.
It's flattery, though, if you're calling him Stan.
There we go. And John Hogoboom. Welcome, John.
Thanks.
I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's go ahead and get into some of the more spooky things that are going on. And sorry,
it's all right.
Can't help it. I got the giddies today.
It's all right. You got to start with a pun.
Got to start with something.
So this is a bug they're calling Phantom. FireEye researchers found this interesting bug and named it after the ghost bug that was, I think, in glibc a couple months back.
Yeah, a few months back. Yeah.
So the idea in this bug is that it's a bug in the core networking code of iOS, which has since been patched. But it turns out that if you can control the proxy settings for an iOS device, you can actually cause certain use after free bugs to manifest and crash certain processes, which is mostly annoying. But it turns out that someone found that you can use it to actually crash the activation lock feature on iOS devices. Now, activation lock, it's not completely locking a device out. I mean, you can still use the device when activation lock is turned on, but what you can't do is wipe the device or set up a new iTunes profile. So basically, this vulnerability allows thieves to steal a phone and then remove that lock functionality and then go ahead and wipe the phone. I haven't seen it done in practice. The videos I've seen online seem to indicate that it causes massive instability in iOS, as in, you start trying to do anything once the malicious proxy is set up and apps just will not run. If you reboot the device in the video that I saw, you can't even use the swipe to unlock. You've kind of hosed up your device pretty good. So there's multiple ways of actually using this bug. If you can control the proxy.pack file, the proxy autoconfig, or you can push a malicious configuration profile, which is something that iOS devices support. You can push this proxy setting as well. I think someone mentioned you can do it with a malicious DNS server that also provides other settings, but yeah, it's kind of interesting. It looks like it's been patched though, which is good. So if anybody has an iOS device, now is the time to patch.
So do you know what versions of iOS this affects?
I believe it affects versions in iOS 8. I don't recall the exact numbers, but the links that go in the show notes should have the affected versions.
Okay. Yeah, because that's I think that's going to be an important thing. I think they just came out with 8.1.3.
8.3 is the one that just came out in the last week. But there are some issues for folks like me who use iOS devices in aviation that there are some folks suggesting holding off on 8.3 because there's an issue with Bluetooth GPSs and iPads. So hopefully that'll get solved quickly. I know that 8.4 is in beta already, so hopefully that'll be fixed soon.
So keeping a good line of patches coming out for iOS. That's a good thing. You keep it up on those things. That sounds like an interesting one. I'm wondering if we're going to hear some more about that going forward, or if it's just the fundamental of the patching process is going to kind of make it obviate the need.
Well, luckily Apple does have that, patching pretty much gets done on a regular schedule. There may be people who aren't connecting their devices to an external network and not getting those patches. There's always that long tail of patching that there's only going to be at least one, maybe a handful of devices out there that don't get what they ought to be getting.
I have encountered some people, and I'm not going to name my wife here, but I have encountered some people that take so many pictures that there's not enough memory to actually do the update. So,
no, that's a thought.
So that's one of the things to keep in mind.
I know someone's wife who has the same problem.
Somebody. So the fact of the matter is that is one of the constraints that you can run into. Is probably something that for folks to keep in mind. That is, if you are a memory user on the device, to go, when you go to purchase a device, go for the next higher memory capacity, but nevertheless, pay attention to how the memory is being used, because you do need a reasonable amount of space to be able to download the new load simultaneous with what's already loaded on there.
Right, to patch it, yeah.
Important piece. Okay, so Jim, let's go to you here. Now, this isn't iOS, but it's OS X. I guess some new patches out associated with that as well.
Right. Yeah, this was a busy week for Apple patches. They released patches for Apple TV and OS X and iOS and all of that. But the particular one I wanted to talk about is was discovered by a researcher in Sweden, Emil Kvarnhammer or something like that. I hope I didn't butcher his name too bad. Who discovered that there's the system startup or the system setup command rather. It's a command line tool that's primarily intended for using to adjust the system preferences and that kind of thing. But it has an API that allows access to root privileges, and it was not quite as protected as some people had thought it was. The bug apparently goes back to at least 2011 and was reported to Apple last fall, and so they fixed it in OS X Yosemite 10.10.3 that came out this past week. One of the big issues is that they indicated that to fix the issue in OS X older than 10.10, 10.9 and earlier, would require a substantial amount of changes on their side, and they will not backport the fix. And this is a bit of a concern because latest estimate is only about 50% of Mac users are on 10.10 or greater. So the upshot of it is this system setup utility has some issues. The API that they use underlying that has some issues, and it's so extensively and deeply interwoven in the OS that while it's fixed in 10.10, the Apple at this point claims they have no intention of fixing it on earlier releases.
So now, how far back in time are we referring to here when we talk about 10.9, 10.8?
I don't remember exactly when those came out, but as I said, the bug has apparently existed since at least 2011. So we're talking upwards of 4 years now.
So when we talk about users, for previous versions, my presumption is that there's support for a period of time for each of the previous versions that gives you sort of a window or an opportunity to do the updates. But it appears here that they're deciding not to do that. I appreciate the work factor aspect of this, but I was kind of curious if it's really because these are older versions or if it's just the work factor.
The last update for Lion, which was 10.7, was 2012. The last update for Mountain Lion, 10.8, was 2013. Apple would like everybody to move to Yosemite, to the latest one. But as I said, current estimates are that only about 50% of Mac users are on the 10.10 branch.
Okay, well, make sure you go to 10.10. That's, I guess, our advice here.
Yep.
And I guess keeping with our theme of the Apple patch season, just predecessor to the Windows Microsoft Tuesday. Matt, I guess there's another vulnerability that recently was patched as well.
There is another one. It's the hits keep coming, unfortunately, for Apple. This one is called Darwin Nuke. Kaspersky released a little bit of an advisory on this one. It turns out it affects OS X 10.10 and iOS 8. And in this case, it seems that it's kind of a callback to the old ping of death, or Win Nuke, as we were talking about earlier. It seems like a single packet denial of service for these devices. And this is when I say denial of service, I don't mean slow down. I mean full-on kernel panic, done. And it seems that it's code related to the parsing of IP options. If I understand it right, you send this packet of death. The system tries to craft an ICMP response saying something went wrong, but because of a mismatch in the header options and the length of the packet, it drops into a code path that just calls panic, and you're done. So this is going to be, it's again patched, but this is going to be a pain in the butt for anybody using these devices. If you happen to be on a public network, be prepared for somebody to send you a single packet and take you out, and then you reboot and it just happens again.
Right. But there's a patch available for it.
There is a patch.
So, again, just reinforcement. Make sure you get up to date on your patches. But so I assume when you say a panic, it's just causing the device to reboot, right? I mean, it's not bricking it.
It's not bricking
No.
it.
Yeah.
It's putting it to it's going to pop up a message saying, hey, you had a kernel panic error. It may give you a little bit of information about it, but you basically got a hard
Like
restart.
the
at
old
that point.
school blue screen of death that you would get with WinNuke.
But because it's Apple, it's much shinier
Yeah.
and prettier and
It's probably
more
got
friendly.
like
Okay.
some kind of unhappy face or something. I don't know what Apple does.
All right, very good. So I think we've exhausted the whole Apple topic for the moment, and we're going to talk a little bit about a Microsoft vulnerability.
A Windows vulnerability.
And this is like a flashback in itself.
It is actually. So back in 1997, a researcher discovered that you could, if you put in to certain programs URLs that said file:// so normally you put in http:// whatever for a web type thing. But if you put in file:// and then some address for something, what that would do is it would make notably Internet Explorer, which is the one you would worry about most, but there's a lot of other things like Adobe Flash, other types of apps that can handle URLs. Reach out to that address using SMB. And when it does that, your device is automatically going to pass your username, your domain name, I think, and your password hash. So here's the vulnerability is that if you can either become man in the middle of some conversation, you don't even necessarily need to do that. You could craft some malicious websites or do some drive-by type of things where if you have control of a malicious server, user goes to a website that maybe goes to get a GIF image or something, that malicious website that maybe an attacker controls responds with a 302 redirect that says, no, it's here, it's at file:// blah, 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 which is also a malicious SMB server that he controls. Now the client victim machine connects to that, he passes his password hash and whatever to it. That machine would just harvest those together for later password cracking that, you could try to crack those passwords. Really, the GIF angle is a probably good one as an example because those are things that you can bury in image type tags that might not even be visible to the user except it'll just show up as like a broken image or something on the web page that they go to visit. And maybe not even that if you make it a like 1x1 pixel or smaller type of image. So they mentioned that there's the typical scenarios for abuse are in targeted attacks they might try to do these types of things, malicious ads, which we kind of alluded to with images and whatnot. And Wi-Fi access points. So similar to your ping of death that you were talking about with the Darwin nuke there, if you're on a Wi-Fi access point, it's really easy to intercept or inject yourself into conversations on open Wi-Fi access points, or an attacker, I should say, can kind of get into the conversations with other users on that Wi-Fi and then leverage this type of attack. This is just a quick list of lots of widely used applications that are vulnerable to this, handling these file URLs and performing this behavior if they're past one of these. So Adobe Reader, big one. Most important one, probably Internet Explorer, Windows Media Player. Those ones are really the Internet Explorer. Although Excel also, and a bunch of other applications here.
And that's simply the fact that they honor the file://
Right. So if they receive that in some other content like HTTP or whatever, they'll honor that and try to reach out to it.
Is that because you're using the Windows libraries that support that functionality?
I didn't get that deep into it. It could be very well that that's why that is, but I'm not quite sure why each application, if it's some common library function or not. From a mitigation standpoint, the easiest option probably is to try to block outbound 139 TCP and 445 TCP. You can do that either at your endpoint firewall. Of course, that'll prevent you from using SMB at all to even like stuff on your trusted network. But probably more practically is to block it in your network firewall, assuming you've got a trusted network that you're on. That's not going to help you at a Wi-Fi access point. So if you're on a Wi-Fi access point, only the endpoint firewall would really protect you from this until it gets patched. So it's been around since 1997. It was identified. These guys kind of flipped the script on a little bit, kind of explored it a little bit more in depth, and have put together a really good white paper on how you can leverage this in various different types of attack scenarios. So it's an interesting read. It's something I hadn't really thought about. It's one of those simple things that, gee, I never thought about that. That makes sense that this would work.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a matter of, this is a case of creative thinking that's been sort of, you know, the problem's been kind of hanging out there, and it was a matter of getting noticed.
Right, right.
And so I agree with you. I think from an enterprise point of view, you certainly can block it at the perimeter. It's good practice anyway, because there are a lot of other things that have traditionally been problematic about SMB. So, you know, that would be the recommended approach. I guess I'm wondering to what extent that it's practical. You know, if you know where your file servers are within your enterprise, even I think the endpoint firewall would be perhaps a practical way where you put some specific roles in place.
Right. You could probably block everything, but allow certain, you know, file servers that you always use all the time.
Right.
Kind of thing.
So that might be, you know, even if you just kind of allocate it to the data centers that you know about and address blocks associated with those, it'd still at least close down the attack purview significantly.
Right.
Interesting one. So, and you know, invariably, exploits like this turn into botnets. Well, perhaps not invariably, but to a large extent, you know, quite often they do. So, Matt, I guess there have been a couple botnets that were taken down recently. They've gotten a little bit of press around them.
Yep.
Can you give us a little context?
Yeah, so this is great news. So there were two major botnet takedowns in the last week. The first one is the Simda botnet, and that was headed up by Interpol and Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit.
That is the takedown.
The takedown was no. Right. I'm sorry. I did not mean to make any. No. These are the good guys taking down the bad guys. Not okay. But wow, that was a mistake. So anyway, Simda was a botnet that was basically making modifications to host files on individual infected machines and redirecting people's traffic to bad guy servers, which has all sorts of ripe for abuse sort of things, tricking them to phishing, other things. So this was a coordinated takedown with a number of other law enforcement agencies, and it's good news for the community. And so at this point, the only thing left to do is to track and clean up all the infected machines, and Shadow Server is giving out information as to how to do this. Individual users can go to the Interpol website, get information on how to find out if I'm infected, what to do about it. So a big win there. The second one is the AAEH botnet, also known as Beebone, and this takedown was headed up by Europol, again with a number of other law enforcement agencies around the world. Beebone, or AAEH, and I think there's actually several other names, which is common for malware, was a downloader. So it was being installed on machines, and its purpose was primarily to install other malware. So the business model was basically access for other malware to get onto the machine. So again, this one's been taken down. Score one for the good guys. And there's a website out there you can take a look at that Europol is providing information on. Again, how do I know I'm infected? What do I do if I'm infected? And information is being sent out to track the cleanup of that as well.
Now, considering there are some law enforcement organizations involved in this, no arrests that we're aware of at this point, or?
From what I know, there were no arrests. I believe that at least for the Simda botnet, I believe there was intention to pursue the creators of it. But as far as I know, no legal action has been taken against anybody for running these, which is something that you would sort of expect for a coordinated law enforcement run event. That people are starting to learn over time that taking down the software and the infected machines is one thing, but until you get rid of the bad actors behind the botnets, they'll simply start up again with a fresh set of infected machines.
It doesn't really take too much time to transition. I think we'll talk about that in a little bit, right? So I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. The big challenge is finding who's behind these things. Actually, another big challenge behind that is sometimes they're in a place that aren't really accessible by the law enforcement. And so at least the fact that these were through Interpol and Europol, that they are coordinated efforts that are crossing country borders, that's a good sign. But there are still places that are relatively inaccessible from extradition point of view, or to be able to bring it. Now, they didn't sound like they were terribly sophisticated botnets.
So both of these are actually very highly polymorphic. Simda they created a new version of that every few hours, whereas Beebone or AAEH, they actually created a new version as many times as 19 times a day. So this makes it very, very hard for antivirus companies to stay on top of the latest samples when you have to keep tracking new samples.
I just kind of locked in on the fact that it was modifying the host
Oh yeah.
Host table, which is basically, that's like sort of the classic thing, that is, if you can modify something, just modify that file and then you can start redirecting.
It also minimizes the amount of code you actually have to leave on the system. As long as all of the bad stuff is being taken care of on an external server, there's not much to look for. It's kind of like the DNS changer malware we saw a couple years back, where all it was doing was repointing the DNS servers to the same effect, where all of the traffic for that user would be redirected to another place where nefarious things could occur.
And even if the malware gets cleaned up, they're still going to
There's
try to go to those.
there's a chance that entries could remain behind. Yeah,
so
so
part of the remediation.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps something to share with the audience here. That is, to go mitigating malware, to actually move malware files is one thing, but it's very difficult to identify what all the configuration changes might be. We mentioned just the host table, but there could be all kinds of registration entries that can cause, strange behaviors. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, it's probably best to just re-image the machine and start over. Even if you're backing up the data files and taking the chance that reintroducing those might isn't going to cause a problem on the system, the re-imaging process is really their safest path. So, all right, cool. Well, it's good to see some progress around this. I see, I've seen a lot more evidence that the law enforcement organizations are actively pursuing these. I know the FBI come out with that Operation Clean Slate a while back, and that seems to be continuing to be active, so all good signs. And I guess on the other front of things, we'll go back to the patching activities, which is prevent the vulnerabilities that prevent the exploits that prevent the botnets. So, Jim, what can you tell us about what's coming up with Microsoft's patches this month?
Today is Microsoft Patch Tuesday, and this month, for the month of April, they issued 11 bulletins. 4 of them Microsoft rated as critical, and the other 7 they rated as important. In order for Microsoft to rate something as critical, pretty much it has to be possible to exploit without any user intervention. And that's something that I have some personal disagreement with Microsoft about how they rate some of these things, but that's my personal problem. If the infection can be done by a user, if the user has to click on something, they won't rate that as critical. How many spams and spear phishing cases have we seen where the bad guys do a good job of luring somebody into clicking something, and telling them all the time not to click on links in their email doesn't completely stop it. So, but anyway, 4 of the bulletins this month Microsoft rated as critical. One of them was the Internet Explorer update, which patches something like 7 or 10 CVEs. There was a Microsoft Office bulletin that allowed remote code execution, and this is one that currently there are exploits in the wild. So MS-15-033 is very important if you're running Office 2007 or 2010. Microsoft rates it only as important if you're running Office 2013 or Office 365, but critical for 2007, 2010. MS-15-034 is in the http.sys drivers, and basically any Windows system that is running a web server, be it IIS or Apache or whatever, this one is critical to apply there. That they could be exploited by sending a malicious crafted HTTP GET request. And this is Jim Clausing with a quick update. At the time we recorded the show on Tuesday afternoon, I mentioned that MS-15-034 The http.sys vulnerability was one of the critical bulletins released by Microsoft, but at that time there was no exploit in the wild. As of this morning, Thursday morning, April 16th, not only is there an exploit in the wild, there are two versions of the exploit in the wild now. One is a simple denial of service, and the second one is a remote code execution. Unfortunately, the denial of service one is the easier one to do, and it is being actively exploited. There is at least one system out of Turkey that is actively scanning across the internet using the denial of service version of the exploit. So it is now highly imperative that if you have a web server running on a Windows system, that you apply MS 15-034 as soon as possible. The exploit works over SSL, so your intrusion prevention systems may not be able to protect you against it. This one is now highly critical. It's one you need to patch immediately. So we wanted to do this quick update and let you know. Thanks. The other critical one is in the Microsoft graphics component stuff. The same graphics components that we've been seeing exploited for 10 years now. Another one that they only rated as important but is a little worrisome to me is MS 15-037, which is a vulnerability in the Windows task scheduler that allowed privilege escalation. And this one worries me because in a couple of recent cases we've seen the bad guys use a task scheduler to elevate their privileges. So anytime that I see a task scheduler one, that gets my attention. But yeah, 11 bulletins, 4 of them critical. As we say every month, check them out, but apply them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I have to agree with you in the context of what you mentioned, what defines critical. I remember going back. There was some time ago where a colleague of ours, Michael Singer, was trying to coin the term wormable. I think he used Wikipedia as a place to kind of just define the term wormable, and I think it ultimately ended up getting removed because we didn't have any references at the time to be able to back it up, which is one of the basic criteria. But ultimately, it sounds like what they define as critical would be something that, if it's remotely executable, it effectively would be a wormable exploit or vulnerability. I think you pointed out one that has exploits in the wild, and my opinion, I guess maybe it's the dynamics of being able to change the criticality of a vulnerability based on the fact that there are exploits in the wild, and perhaps that's what's resisting it. But I think that is a factor to consider, even to consider how practical it might be to create an exploit relatively reasonably. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
One of the things that Microsoft has done for the last 2 years or so is give an exploitability assessment, an exploitability score to each of the CVEs covered in these bulletins. And on all of the criticals, there is at least one CVE that has an exploitability index of 1. That is, exploitation is likely, in the next 30 days or so. And the one CVE that is currently being exploited in the wild, that's a exploitability score of 0. So the lower the number, the more critical it is to patch quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, they won't rate it as a critical if it can be exploited by drive-by, and that kind of, I disagree with that, because if a user, without realizing it, just by browsing to some website that's got malicious ads or something, can get completely owned, I think that's an issue. But that's an argument that I've had with them before, and I'm probably not going to win that one. So.
Not anytime soon. But I think perhaps to your point, from our perspective, since we're not going to change how the rating is done, you always have the option of doing your individual assessments, but perhaps it's just simply looking at the critical vulnerabilities and just patching for those isn't enough. You really need to be patching them much more aggressively and trying to get rid of ones that certainly, at least in the important category, relatively quickly.
Right, especially if you take a look at their exploitability assessment. If it's got a low exploitability number, Microsoft anticipates that there will be exploits for it in the relatively near future. So those are the ones that you really need to pay attention to.
And to your point earlier, you said you mentioned drive-by or basically something through a phishing attack or something like that. If it's a user, it's basically a privilege escalation is what it amounts to. If you can use the exploit to escalate from a user privilege to escalate to administrator privileges, certainly that factors into this.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, good. Thanks, Jim. And I guess what we're going to do is transition over to John here. You've been chiming in from here to there.
Yeah, we got a lot of discussion. I'm gonna give you a nice little segue to slide into the internet weather with this one.
Okay.
So the Talos group, actually in cooperation with Cisco, I guess Talos might be.
Talos is actually a group within Cisco.
Oh, is it? It's like their research arm or whatever,
Exactly,
security
yeah.
research arm. They put out this report up on Cisco's blog. Interesting report about a group that they call SSHPsychos, also Group 93, I think. Basically, the group is out there scanning the internet very aggressively for SSH servers that are listening. And then once they find them, they brute force they attempt to brute force their way in. They have a password list of about 300,000 or so passwords that they'll try to brute force on each target that they're able to identify. They've been tracking this one for a while. I mean, we talk about, SSH scanning and all other types of scanning that we see in the internet weather. So I'm sure some of this is mixed in with all of that activity we see. What their report is kind of identifying is that there's really two primary address blocks. It used to be just one, which we have up on the screen in this chart here. And at some point, right before they were about to do some kind of takedown operations for their own mitigation operations, I should say, they actually switched to another one. Another address block, but all of the scanning activity has been primarily sourced from those two address blocks. So they scan from there, they do their brute forcing from there. Once they get into a machine, we've seen this kind of stuff before as well. A lot of the IoT stuff actually works like this, where they'll brute force their way into the SSH on these little home routers and whatnot. But once they get in there, they download a DDoS rootkit onto the machine, which then goes and reaches back to a command and control, which retrieves an XOR encoded config file, and they decoded one of those and showed it in this report. I recommend that you read the report, it's kind of interesting. Contains a list of IPs to deny, to not allow to talk to this device anymore, which is an interesting list of IPs when you go look at it. People they don't want to get in to this device that they've just compromised. I won't comment. And it also lists a bunch of file names that it should go look for and delete, which if you look at those also looks like it might be cleaning up in case somebody else had already compromised this device and dropped other malware on this machine. So it's whoever they are, they seem to know some of these other tool sets that are in play, and they go look for them and try to remove them so that they own this device, in as much of entirety as possible. Cisco kind of worked with Level 3, one of the larger ISPs out there. Level 3 actually initiated some activity to blackhole these two address blocks within their own network to help protect any of their customers that might be on there from getting scanned and brute forced into. Interesting chart that I pulled together here. So this shows those two address blocks that they're scanning from, the attackers, and their report, the first bubble here on the left-hand side, talks about that their report says they're kind of certain that this activity might have started back into the June 2014 timeframe. If that's true, there's some other address blocks they were originating that scanning from. It doesn't show up in our report. But somewhere in the November timeframe here, this is a 180-day chart. I looked back all the way for a year and there was nothing, so I just kind of abbreviated here. But somewhere in the November timeframe, we see that first address block coming into play. And in the report, they mentioned that on March 30th that they pivoted to that new address block, and that's represented in the blue here. Kind of interesting, though, that we actually saw the activity maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 days prior to the March 30th there from this new address block. So I think there was more of an overlap transition as opposed to a cut and go to the new one in one phase there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that that first IP block, when I did that, my last update on what we were seeing in the Kippo honeypots, 9 of the top 10 addresses that were scanning our honeypot were from that first net block.
Interesting, yeah.
So yeah, we definitely saw some of this.
So I guess the long and short of it, interesting that they did some black hole routing to try to protect themselves. But again, and we talked about this a lot in other cases, this is kind of a whack-a-mole kind of approach. It'd be nicer to try to figure out who the actors are behind it, work with law enforcement to get them so that they cannot continue their operation.
Right.
However, doing something is better than nothing in a lot of cases, especially when you could do something that's going to have a large positive effect. Blocking blocks of address blocks is going to really hinder that actor set because now they need to go to a whole different location. Blocking IPs at a time is not really effective. That's really whack-a-mole. But anyway.
Yeah, well, that becomes one of the challenges here. And even you got to wonder to what extent they're really dependent on address blocks for what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, they could just move into a bunch of different cloud devices which have different addresses and would be much harder to track in the same context that's being done here. So I think that's I think your point is valid. Blocking addresses really is not the solution to botnets. We've learned that through many years of experience. So.
Yeah.
Okay, going on to some other topics here related to internet weather. First item is, we've been reporting for a while some denial of service attacks, basically an increase in denial of service attacks using SNMP, that's port 161 UDP. So we see this as source port 161 UDP because it's a reflection attack from SNMP servers that are on the internet. That activity seems to be relaxing a little bit. Not as significant as we'd seen in the past, but it hasn't really been that big of an issue in any case. And what I mean by that, to put this into context, I sort of overlaid the other reflective denial of service attack activity over the last 180 days in this graph here. And you can see kind of down here in the, the dark blue, that represents the contribution from SNMP activity, along with the other contributions from character generator, packet fragmentation, DNS reflection attack activity, NTP, that's port 123, as well as SSDP, that's port 1900 UDP. So not really big change. It seems to be relatively stable. We do actually see a little bit of a surge in activity here that was relatively recent, I think a couple of weeks ago. It looks like character generator was the bigger contributor, perhaps sort of a shift from the SNMP to character generator in this activity.
And I think character generator creates a lot of fragmented packets.
It will tend to create fragmented packets if done correctly, yeah. John, you reported on this last week. I think this is perhaps the third week of us reporting on this activity.
Still a mystery.
Scan sources, what we detect as scan sources on 4143 UDP as well as 4183 UDP. We're showing 30 days of data here, so it's relatively new activity starting around the end of March, near the end of March there. It appears to be P2P activity. And you had done a little bit of packet analysis on this to get some insight on what's going on.
I haven't been able to isolate any two devices talking to each other in any kind of peer-to-peer communication, though. I can't say that I've tried real hard.
Well, and there aren't that many contributors here,
right.
So the network's relatively small still. I mean, it's still in the thousands, but it's not relative to the size of the internet, relatively small. So it would be kind of a needle in a haystack in a sense.
Yeah, that's a little bit of the problem. I also did some botnet analysis just to see if is there anything other than peer-to-peer in the kind of traditional centralized command and control that we're used to looking for. So doing some net flow analysis, say, okay, throw away all the scanning activity they're doing. What else are they all talking to in common? I didn't see anything,
right.
Which is interesting. I mean, maybe not unexpected. I was kind of hoping I might find something, but didn't find anything right away. So that could be a visibility thing too. Maybe I didn't, have enough flow data or see, as many devices I need to make that kind of correlation. But or maybe they only check in once a day and I missed that time span.
For some reason, and this is just a hunch on my part, that I kind of reflect back on this Storm botnet from years ago and how it kind of behaved. You did a lot of analysis or tracking of that botnet back then. Any thoughts on how this, any similarities to this one?
I don't know enough about it yet, to be honest with you. This is still a little bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah.
I mean, the Storm botnet we did, in some of these peer-to-peer botnets, you'll find that they, whoever runs them compromises, a large set of these lower tier ones, these devices that can participate. And then when they identify that some of these participants actually have direct internet access and they can act as kind of a command and control, they'll elevate those to like an upper echelon tier as a more privileged part of the botnet. And Storm did that. There's another one that did that too that's escaping me right now. I want to say actually like one of the Zeus Game Overs or one of those. Somebody had a peer-to-peer component in one of the Zeus.
Yeah,
That's correct.
We did have like higher level nodes, like centralized.
Yeah, I vaguely remember something about that.
Or proxies,
Maybe there's something like that here, but we don't even really know what this is, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, and I think this is fundamentally one of the challenges when you have these Internet of Things kind of scenarios and they don't have any virus, and so the antivirus vendors aren't picking it up. They're not sitting in front of a firewall, and so the firewall vendors aren't picking it up. And so it's kind of hidden for a period of time until we can get a little bit of handle on this one. So
yeah, another thing that's interesting about it is it's a wide array, as far as I can tell, of different types of IoT devices. It's not, a particular vendor model or a small set of vendor models. It seems like there's quite a large array of different types of devices, which makes me kind of scratch my head as how does somebody know how to compromise so many of these different types of devices?
Those ports 4143 and 4183 may not be the infection vectors themselves. They just may have chosen those for the peer-to-peer.
Right, agreed. But when you actually look at what those devices are that are participating, if you poke them and do some fingerprinting, you'll see that they're all different. They're all very different types of devices,
things,
different manufacturers. So I don't know what to make of that yet.
All right. So just another observation about this. I think, John, you had pointed this out last week as well. It's still relatively consistent. That is, the 4143 seems to be very much centered around the United States, whereas the 4183 basically in other parts of the world. It seems like there's been a little more smearing between the two, perhaps. And I used a larger address sample in this case than you did last week, so perhaps that's a factor associated with this. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list here, port 22 TCP. Well, we've kind of already had a little discussion about that and some of the implications associated with it. Followed by 135 TCP, that's still going strong as we've been reporting for many weeks now. 53 UDP has jumped up a little bit, so we're going to take a quick look at that. I think it's mostly related to denial of service attack activity. There were actually a couple of scenarios that contributed to this, so we'll talk about that in a moment. 443 TCP, that also moved up, but I wouldn't describe it as a significant anomaly or change in the behavior that relative to what we've seen in the past. Port 80 TCP, it's web 445 TCP, a regular on the list here. And then the 1433 Microsoft SQL database, 3389, that's a remote desktop protocol. 8080 TCP, we're going to take a little bit of a look at that later on in the context of sources doing the probing. And then we'll also take a look at port 23 later as well.
I'm wondering, have we ever seen 443 have a higher volume than 80? I always kind of assumed in my head that 80 and 443 scanning were maybe looking for the same kinds of vulnerable software, simply one under HTTP and one under SSL.
Yeah, I think one of the things with 443 is it's climbed in terms of the number of probes, partly because of vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and Poodle and Ghost, and so there's a lot of, it's not necessarily even malicious scanning per se. You can't tell from a probing point of view, even if you're on the receiving end of it. But there are a lot of researchers that are running around and probing things, and so that contributes to the change here, where they're not probing on 80, they're probing.
That's a good point.
Exclusively on 443.
Well, and there may also be, there are more sites that are forcing folks to go to HTTPS rather than HTTP.
Well,
so that may also contribute to some of that
that's true.
flip-flop.
That's true. As I mentioned, port 53 UDP climbed quite a bit here, and there are actually two contributing factors here. Some of it is related to reflective denial of service attacks. So on the request side, if there's a spoof source, if it's going out to and sending requests out to lots of DNS servers to get responses back to to that target, that will look like scanning activity in the analysis. And then the other factor that's here is I think we've seen some cases where there have just been source addresses that are basically a spoof source, most likely, where they're just spraying out to an address block that they're targeting. So, I think this is significant if you are subscribing to a DDoS mitigation service, that you have the capability to be able to protect address blocks, because if they're all sort of homed off the same circuit, the attacker can spread the attack across all the addresses on that block and to be able to try to fill up the circuit. And that appears to be the case that they're doing in a couple of the attacks here, I think notably the spikes that you're seeing. And then, as I mentioned, port 23 has moved down in the list. We had seen it much farther up on the list, and so I thought it'd be worth pointing out. This is actually looking at the number of probes we're seeing on port 23 for the last 180 days. We are relatively low compared to some of the other activity, but what I really wanted to sort of point out is this trend that we've seen over the last several weeks, where there's a spike in the activity and then this deterioration, which is sort of a telltale sign of a botnet, where lots of destinations or targets have been told to do some scanning activity, and over time it sort of deteriorates. And these little spikes that are in here are actually, I think, researchers that are kind of probing around. I'd have to go back and validate it, because there are actually some what I'll describe as malicious actors doing the same sort of thing. Looking at the most sources doing the probing, we have at the top of the list port 445 TCP, so that had been taken over by port 23 some time ago, but 445 is back at the top of the list, followed by port 80 TCP, and then we see port 23 that's moved farther down the list. And then we're also seeing the port 4143 and 4183 in the list as well. Last that we'll mention here, but not least, is port 8080 TCP. And John, you had brought up 8080 TCP last week.
I did.
You had showed 30 days where there was a clear, ramping up activity. So I just thought I'd give a little bit of a different perspective, looking back 180 days, actually 90 days we're looking at here. And it is true, most of these are from China, although I think the demographic actually may be a little bit misleading. So I think you'd noted that most of the probes were from China. Actually, most of the sources are pretty well dispersed. And so that was one of the things that, one of the observations is just looking at, in terms of the number of sources, the
Chinese probes were more aggressive than
the Chinese probes have
sources.
tended to be more aggressive, but there are lots of other places, and it's very widespread.
Right.
So perhaps could provide a geographic map if this continues in the state next week. But also, it's also interesting to see that there's sort of been this long trend of deterioration and then a quick growth in activity, and that's continuing forward as well.
It'll be interesting to
clearly
see if that
indicating
decline slopes down again over the next, 4 weeks or so.
So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can find ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. That's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's available on YouTube as well as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter as well. Our handle is @ATT Security. So thanks, Jim. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, John. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.